Greetings, thank you for joining me today. Anyone that's been watching the news recently will have seen Centrica, the big company, the corporation that owns, amongst other things, British Gas, posted massive profits for 2022, massive profits up from the profits they were making in 2021. Now, throughout the pandemic times, they made awesome profits, £948 million apparently, and now they're up in 2022 to 3.3 billion. That's a ridiculous hike in the profits by anybody's standards. They blame that in part on the sale of part of the business, but British Gas is still core of the Centrica business model, and they've seen a great boost in the number of customers that they handle since the likes of Bulb folded. But since its inception, British Gas has never been good for its customers. Centrica has never been good for its customers. Let's just get back to British Gas. Now, as those who watched my videos for a while will know, one of my first jobs was working for British Gas, and it was within what they call gas billing. So folk would call in with their meter readings and ask questions as to why the gas bill was so high. And back then it was just gas, and eventually they moved on to supply electricity as well when they were allowed to. Same sort of thing though, always people asking why the bill was so high. And it's been so high because British Gas applied a great big markup. They apply a markup on the sale of the energy, the gas or the electricity, and they apply a markup by way of a daily charge, a standing charge as they call it, which is what they charge you for the privilege of having a line or a pipe to your house and maintaining the meter that gets replaced once every 30 years, if ever. But now, and you think, oh, yeah, that's part of doing business with the utility companies, but it's money for nothing, because once that infrastructure is in place, you just keep paying, and at something like 50p a day in some cases, it soon adds up. Now, if you look at countries across Europe, where you can also buy gas and electricity, the price compared to the UK isn't awfully high. In fact, the UK is one of the most expensive places in the whole world to buy your gas and electricity. And this is primarily because the government's discouraged investment in the infrastructure and encouraged companies to get in there and charge as much as they want, make as much profit as possible, and all that goes back to a limited number of shareholders. Of course, it was sold off under the premise of, oh, if you see Sid tell him everyone can have a piece of the pie, but really ultimately most of us don't have the spare money to buy stocks and shares and trade in them, and it's only the big guys, the extremely wealthy, that profit from the whole situation. So, government says it's okay to charge what you like. That's exactly what they've done. I think it's deplorable, but British Gas from the inception, Centrica from its inception, has never been a nice company. They've always been bad for the consumer. A good example of this, just one of many, was when I worked in the British Gas billing centre. I took calls from domestic customers predominantly. But the one day I took a call from a customer who was using domestic meters but actually had a factory unit. Not the way it should be. Of course, if you've got a factory unit, you should have a factory meter in place, but it's all kind of geared towards the amount of gas they perceive you're going to use. But in this case, it was a factory unit with factory unit size gas hot air heating system. So you'd expect it to have appropriate meters for that. Meters that allow an appropriate flow of gas and meter it properly. And it's all geared towards the business, so it's not going to be prohibitive. They have a different billing structure, and rightly so. But not in this guy's case, because he had domestic meters, and they were reading an awful lot of gas, and he had a domestic contract that he'd signed. So he agreed to pay a certain price for his gas per unit, thinking, oh, well, British Gas, they're okay, and they're not going to screw me over, are they? But they did, because there was no checks and balances to really look at what he was using and is this appropriate. First thing he knew that there was a problem was when the ladies who worked in the unit started to report that it was awfully hot, and these are people who come India, and they reported it was awfully hot in the unit and they were starting to pass out with the heat. And they discovered that the boilers, the furnaces, were running full pelt and there's no way to stop them. The easiest way to stop them would be turn off the gas, and hopefully that would be an end to it, except they couldn't get to the meters. They're in a locked cupboard. And where was the landlord? Who knows? So it took some time to break down that door and finally get to the meters and turn off the gas. At which point they thought, well, director says, let's call in the meter readings and find out what the cost is at this point, halfway through the year, and let's see if we can pass some of that damage on to the landlord. In the end, it wasn't able to do that. But the bill was awfully high, because the domestic meters had gone round the clock several times during the months that he'd been in the unit. Absolute nightmare, because rather than a substantial bill of a couple of thousand, he was facing a bill of tens of thousands. This was enough to push any business over the edge. You can't plan for this sort of nonsense. Now, the usual sort of calls I took would be people just call in with reading, people call in with one query, I'd speak to them once, and off they would go. I might take a payment, and I might take a payment next quarter, but that'd be the most I'd hear from them. Not this guy. As the issue progressed, now you might have expected British Gas would maybe play nice and realise the mistake was the meters in the wrong place, the wrong sort of meters, the wrong sort of contract, and maybe rework things, rather than push the business under. But no, we'd signed, so they were going to take him for the full amount that they'd agreed to pay. Right or wrong, it didn't matter. That's exactly what they were going to do. And they'd follow the same sort of principle if they were dealing with a domestic user, somebody who's got a boiler that maybe is older than he needs to be, someone in a rental property where they don't control what the appliances are, they've still got high usage, and they'll just assume you use the gas, you pay for the gas on the contract you've agreed to sign. And then happily up the price, happily chase people as far as need be. Now, of course, there's the process whereby, if you're a domestic customer and your bill goes too high, they'll fit you a token meter, and then you slowly pay back the overpayment by way of a markup on top of what you regularly pay for your gas. And when that meter's left in after you've paid off your bill, you're still paying far more for your gas than you were on the original meter. And they've used that for years. Consumers haven't been better off under this system. It's an inconvenient, irritating system to use, and the consumer always pays more. Can't really apply that logic to that way of recovery to a business, though, so they just take you to court and seize goods if they can. Deplorable. One of many examples. Now, don't get me wrong. Whilst I don't appreciate the way the utility industry is abusing customers, i.e. people like me, I did have fun in my couple of years that I spent at British Gas. It was a debt management role without calling it that, but it was good fun. There was aspects of it that I enjoyed. I was a lot of database cleansing, and ultimately I made a lot of friends and had a great time. There are many worse places to work, but, and there is always a but, it kind of led to other things. You sort of get used to an industry and you can kind of pursue other roles. Now at that stage, the role came to an end because British Gas were using an agency and they decided to dump them for a cheaper agency, so off I hopped to find something better paid, because I was not going to take a pound an hour cut in my wages for doing the same job. Absolutely not, because over a 37-hour week, you can see that adds up. And I very quickly found myself moving on to better jobs, and I was able to buy a house and move to Wolverhampton. And then I circled back to the gas industry, because after a while I got made redundant and found myself working again for a temp agency. This time they found me a position over in, as it was Dudley, where British Gas services were being run. Now they have other offices, but this is this was where the main call centre was at the time. It was my first day on that particular call centre was 9/11. So you can guess how that day panned out. But as it was, a nice little call centre, and what they did at British Gas Services, part of the Centrica group, they sell repair contracts to their customer base. So anyone who's got a boiler and other gas appliances they want regular servicing on, and I recommend it because they need it for safety, they would sell that contract. So as part of the contract you pay a regular, relatively high fee, and once a year you get some guy come out and check it over, give it a once over, make sure it's safe and do the service as necessary. Nothing wrong with that. And as a result of that, as a result of working for British Gas, I'd always thought that it was well worth having a gas service contract for my gas appliances. So when I bought my first house, that's what I had for the first 5 years. And then the boiler broke. And it was one of those boilers that wasn't repairable because they stopped making the parts. Now this brings me to what British Gas Services do. Now they're not interested in every customer. They're not interested in servicing the ancient boilers because honestly they're less efficient overall. You can't get the parts after a certain length of time, when the manufacturers decide to move on and produce other things. And ultimately it's a bad deal for the customers. There's nothing wrong with that. But they still charge an awful lot of money for what they offer. You can go out and get yourself a service engineer who doesn't work for the group, and you can get them a lot cheaper. Now, whether you want to go through the hassle of finding someone who's available when you need them, that's a different matter, and that's what the service contract was there for. So you pay a certain fee, and yes, you get a service once a year, but if your boiler breaks down within that year, you can give British Gas Services a call, and they would come out and send an engineer out to find out what the issue is and start the process of getting things resolved. And the more you pay, the less you pay for the parts. So there's an element of saving there if your boiler's about to go sideways on you. So the role of British Gas Services for me was to be speaking to new and existing customers, getting the new ones to sign up for the service, sign up for a service contract, or just one-off repairs as required, and keep things rolling. When you do that role, you realise very quickly the prices were too high for a lot of people. They would simply, there's only so much you can push. If someone says, I literally can't afford the price of a repair, then there's nothing more you can do. There's only so much wiggle room you can have as a regular sales rep. In a lot of cases, British Gas Services wouldn't touch an older system because they can't get the parts. So those customers were instantly priced out of the system. Even if they can afford the contract, they can't have the contract because they simply won't cover the devices they own. And the price of replacing something for them at that point might be too high to bear. But I learned something, and it is you can approach this two ways. If you fear that you're going to be priced out of the system, you can buy a device such as an Naga, that is going to be more long-lived. You can buy a device that will survive longer and is easily repairable and upgradable at some cost. And I wouldn't recommend it because it's not the easy route, or you can go the easy route. Now the easy route is to take the money you would have spent on a service contract. So for example, if that's £30-40 a month, if you can spare it, and put it aside. If you can't spare that much, try and put something aside every month. And no, it's not easy, but if you can do that, keep it in your own coffers, because it's always good to have a little spare cash to roll back on if you need it. But put that money aside and save it. Save it for a couple of years. Average life of a boiler is at best 4 years. After that point, that manufacturer has generally moved on. Sure, they might still sell the parts, but you don't want to be sticking with a boiler that's 4 years old or older, because that boiler will be less efficient, certainly less efficient than the modern offerings, and there'll be more to go wrong. The longer you keep it, the worse it's going to get. Once every 4 years, take the money you've saved and get yourself a brand new boiler. Not an expensive boiler, not massively expensive, but just a brand new boiler with at least 2 years guarantee on it. And have that installed once every 4 years. Now, you might not install the whole system. You might not need to do that. You wouldn't need to necessarily touch your radiators, just get them flushed. But just have the boiler unit ripped out and replaced. Sell the old one on eBay if you want to. There are other places to sell it, but just give it away to a friend. One way or the other, you're going to be better off than having a service contract. And you're probably going to save a lot on the gas you would have used as well, because your new boiler will be more efficient. You can also consider, of course, upgrading to the modern electric ones, which are all electric, which have less moving parts, and I think this is the way forward, isn't it? As we move towards a gas-free society, it would pay to start replacing these things. And the electric boilers are, I've seen them, there's quite a few out there which are well worth having. Anyway, thank you for listening to my rant. I look forward to speaking to you very soon. Take care. Bye for now.